Today's talk is a good news story. I'm going to take you on a personal journey which reflects the meaning that the Genesis reading that we heard this morning has for me. It is a story of balance between good, bad, and the promise that God makes to us all if we maintain the balance that He originally created. Last Monday, I was invited to have my first dose of the Oxford COVID vaccine. You can guess from my opening remarks that this talk is based on my personal experience, which is a very private person I rarely share. Last year, we booked a holiday on our first ever narrowboat holiday. We were forced to postpone because of the coronavirus restrictions. Upon checking with my insurance company, I discovered that they classed the virus as an act of God. This forced me to ask one of my test questions. What has God got to do with the pandemic? As is typical these days, somebody must take the blame. In the secular culture that we live today, it's not surprising we often look to divert responsibility to anyone other than ourselves. An example was the recent World Health Organization investigation in China, which was focused on trying to find out if there was any justification to blame the authorities in Wuhan for starting the pandemic. Civilized communities throughout history have created organized religion in one form or another. So it's not surprising that if throughout the ages, large-scale plagues and diseases such as COVID are often described as biblical events in the sense that they are beyond the norm and therefore supernatural. Let me now turn to my personal journey and explain the comfort that I'd get from seeing rainbows. Following surgery, I had to go through a radiation treatment protocol. The treatment is accumulative, which means that a small dose of radiation is given at each appointment. Every day, I had to wait my turn for treatment. I sat with other men and women who were either waiting to be irradiated or recovering from their dose of radiation. Whilst my treatment required a very high dose, I was in little danger from the radiation process because it was delivered in numerous small fractions over many weeks. I realized that several of the patients that were sitting with me on a regular daily basis in the waiting room were close to death. The technicians responsible for delivering the radiation dose were acutely aware of the need to maintain balance on many aspects, such as the focus of the beam and the power required to be delivered in each of the daily fractions. I go into some detail about my experience because it's an example of balance between good and bad. We all know that radiation is harmful, but in skilled hands, it can be used as a force for good. Every day for 8 weeks, on my way to treatment, I would go to pray in Southwark Cathedral, which was on my route to the hospital. Upon leaving the cathedral, whilst continuing my walk to Guy's Hospital, I would often pass other cancer patients who had either lost their hair or were exhausted elderly men and women in wheelchairs, being pushed along by their health carers. Often, I would see others who had obviously just emerged from the hospital after receiving surgery. At lunchtimes, the hospital garden was full of smiling doctors, nurses, eager young medical students, and many other people apparently in perfect health, sharing their break times together. It dawned on me, we're all on a journey to the same place, though we all have different times for our final appointment. During those dark days spent in Guy's Hospital, I had a lot of time to think. Thomas Guy made a fortune printing Bibles, and he founded Guy's Hospital to care for the incurable patients sent from the nearby St. Thomas's Hospital. Thomas Guy also made a fortune from the ownership of shares in the slave trafficking firm South Sea Company. I mention his story because it was another first-hand practical example of balance between good and bad. Just at the start of my illness, when the doctors gave me my diagnosis, the same avalanche of feelings returned to me at the start of the pandemic: panic, fear, anger, sadness, confusion, even despair. In the past few months, millions of people have started to share that experience. They have the same feelings that I had, which is fear that they may be moving to their own final appointment with terrifying speed, helped on their way by the COVID pandemic. Fear has been created by the unprecedented speed at which the virus has spread globally. It was first discovered only 14 months ago by a 34-year-old Chinese doctor, Li Weilang. The virus was so virulent that he subsequently died of the disease that he was trying so hard to protect us all from. Barbara and I, like so many people because of our underlying health issues, have been advised by our respective physicians to shield. The frustration of being under house arrest for the past 12 months has led me to ask, why does God allow such suffering on a global scale? My question is essentially the same that many people ask when the news reports show pictures of vast raging forest fires or epic floods caused by climate change, or when a single child suffers and dies from cancer. Scholars explain such disasters are a problem of suffering, the mystery of evil, or the theodicy. These are typical questions that saints and theologians have grappled with for millennia. Obviously, the Bible has something to say on these matters, but in a short talk of this nature, I have not got time to explore. My own conclusions to the question of why we are experiencing such a pandemic, with tens of thousands of people dying in the United Kingdom and millions of people globally, is that I don't know. For me, this is the simplest, most honest and accurate answer. What we do know is that scholarly theological interpretations and explanations of disasters vary widely. So where can we find comfort in these troubled times? This leads me on to ask another of my test questions. If the mystery of suffering is unanswerable, where can the believer go for comfort in times like this? The answer to this test question may be different for each one of us. Obviously, many of us will seek comfort in the Bible. For me, I always fall back on my chemistry training, that I learned about the importance of rules, order, logic. We know that the chemical process is always its most productive when balance is achieved. Statistically, statistical probability supports the 50-50 rule. For example, if a coin is tossed, 50% of the time it will fall heads and 50% of the time it will fall tails. That's why the world is roughly populated 50% with women and 50% with men. Therefore, using the same logic, it would suggest that 50% is good in the world and 50% is bad. God provides us with rules to live by, and these are reflected in the Bible. Genesis is the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. For me, Genesis is an account of creation of the world that was written so that ordinary people can understand. It describes the early history of humanity, Israel's ancestors, and the origins of the Jewish people. Just as an example, the first word in the Torah is Bereshit, and it literally means the beginning. For me, the Genesis narrative attempts to describe a huge amount of complex chemistry in layman's terms. For example, in verse 3, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Light is an electromagnetic energy, the same energy that was used so precisely and carefully balanced during my radiotherapy treatment. It was just a different wavelength. In December 2019, the COVID virus was not known. But the Oxford professor, Sarah Gilbert, through a combination of education and God's good grace, gave her the vision to design a solution to help protect us all. The technique of genome sequencing, used the DIOXY method, was discovered here in the UK in 1970 by the English biochemist Frederick Sanger. The sequence technique tells scientists the kind of genetic information that is carried in particular DNA segment. For example, scientists can use sequence data to determine which stretches of DNA contain genes, which are stretches that carry regulatory instructions, turning the genes on or off. Genome sequencing is one of the tools that scientists will use to track the mutations of the virus and be able to design vaccines at pace in the future so that we will ultimately be able to defeat COVID-19. So in closing, we heard the words in today's reading. This is a sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And so finally, during my free time on the visit to Guy's Hospital, I would find myself gravitating to the quadrangle. I would pause in front of the statue of Thomas Guy. It wasn't great art. Neither was he a perfect person. But standing there each day, saying a little prayer, was meaningful to me. I would wonder if the good that he did, printing high quality Bibles and setting up the hospital, was outweighed by the money he made from the slave trade. I remember thinking, I don't understand why so many people are suffering and dying in this place. But I remember the rainbow being a sign of the promise between God, me, all humanity, and all living creatures of every kind. And I would feel much better for it. Maybe something that I've said will help you find your quadrangle moment. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.